Good morning, Robert. Back from your summer holidays?
Yes, I am, thank you. Good morning, Peter.
So what can you tell us about Theresa May's new proposed Brexit deal, the one that she was basically told to go away and come up with? Is it very different from the first one?
Plan B looks suspiciously like Plan A in slightly altered form, Peter. What we do know is that after several days of discussions with politicians from other parties, Mrs May, and by the way, those talks excluded the leader of the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn, those discussions have resulted in little change to her original Brexit plan. Although she's insisted that she has now unveiled a Plan B, there's little signs of substantive change. The most headline-grabbing announcements made by the May government is that the controversial registration fee for EU citizens living in the EU, at £65 they were being asked to pay to remain in the EU, would now be waived. The Prime Minister has also said she'll be returning to Brussels to try to renegotiate the contentious Northern Ireland backstop, this safety net to preserve a porous border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And now we ought to say that that really is just a gesture to appease the Brexiteers in her own party, because the EU have already ruled out any change to the agreement about the Northern Ireland backstop. And Germany's leadership has reaffirmed that, as has the French, in the last 24 hours. So it's not clear what returning to Brussels
is going to solve,
going to be negotiated.
Yeah.
You can go there and they say, oh, yes, we're not going to change that. Cheerio. This is gesture politics of the absurd.
It's just the stalemate of all stalemates, isn't it? This is going absolutely nowhere. And I don't know whether or not the EU is going to force March the 29th on Britain, but it seems to me that the only thing they can do is to just keep on spinning it out until some sort of deal or another referendum takes place.
That is what Mrs May's strategy seems to be, to try to run down the clock so that she can then go to the Parliament just before the deadline and say, it's either no deal or my deal, and hopes that she could pressure on her party and also opposition MPs. I don't think it's going to work, because I think obviously parliamentarians are no fools. They know exactly what she's doing. And there are mounting pressures on the opposition leader, Jeremy Corbyn, to back a second referendum. There's also cross-party discussions going on. And, one of the things, there are huge areas of silences, Peter, around the EU referendum that led Britain down this path. And I think, it should be borne in mind that the EU referendum result, in which one side won by a bare 3.8%, the Leave side, has been tainted in the last 2.5 years by revelations concerning the use of illegal money, data crime, and probable Russian interference. So that is a tainted referendum in itself. And I hope that Jacinda Ardern, when she's in London, is making it quite clear that Britain has to uphold the rule of law, not least electoral laws, because it's bad news for us if Britain is behaving like a banana republic. It's not good for a major middle-range power like Britain to be indifferent to what's happened.
So do you think that a second referendum really is the only way out of it? And this time people like Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson have just got to stay on the sidelines while the campaign takes place?
Well, I wouldn't say they can stay on the sidelines. I think they should be free to campaign. But I think what has to be done is that the rules have to be tightened and enforced. We can't have people giving huge amounts of money illegally. The Leave side overspent by 10%, we now know. But no one's yet gone to prison. And we are talking about people very close to the Prime Minister. We can understand why Mrs May doesn't want an investigation, because she's the principal beneficiary of the referendum.
Yeah, true, but she's also got to run the country, and she was part of the Remain campaign, so surely she would like a referendum to come up with a different result to what they had in 2016.
But we know in politics, Peter, that people often take positions. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are committed to them. Jeremy Corbyn so-called campaign for the Remain side, and so did Mrs. May. I think Mrs. May made one speech in a 6-week campaign. She also has been accused of blocking an investigation into Aaron Banks, the controversial businessman, when she was Home Secretary, even before the referendum. So, without drawing out the point too much, I think the case for a second referendum is very strong. And actually, this is a point often overlooked. There's nothing to stop Mrs. May looking at the national interest and saying, whichever way you cut it, Brexit is bad for Britain, and therefore we can't proceed.
Yeah, but she doesn't appear to have the courage to do that. And
no, she doesn't, and she's putting the party interest ahead of the national interest.
Yeah.
And this has been a reoccurring pattern. Unfortunately, in politics, as in sport, you're only good as your opponents allow you to be. And at the moment, Mr. Corbyn is not being a particularly rigorous opponent. If Mr. Corbyn came out fully in favour of a second referendum, which is backed by the majority of his MPs and 80% of his supporters, then it will be a completely different scenario. There'll be a lot of pressure for Mrs. May to accede to the momentum towards a second referendum. What we do know is all the polls show that the Remain side now, according to polls, is about, most recent polls, is about 12% ahead.
Yeah. Tell us what would happen if we had a no-deal Brexit. How bad would that be for Britain? How bad or good would it be for New Zealand?
Well, let's be quite clear. It would be very good for a very small minority of already very well-heeled people leading the Brexiteer campaign, mainly financiers. You take people like Jacob Rees-Mogg, one of the leaders of the No Dealers. He's moved his business to Ireland to remain in the single market. So there's a lot of what I call hypocrisy here. In a situation of financial volatility, people do make money on financial markets, and that is what some people are gambling on. But for the great majority, whatever scenario under Brexit, if there's a no-deal scenario, well, we could put it this way, Peter, Britain exports 46% of its exports to the EU. If there's no deal, 46% of Britain's exports will be subject to new tariffs. So we're looking at possible unemployment flowing from that in short order, in excess of 500,000 people plus. So you cannot just simply replace an export market like that overnight.
I appreciate that, but the reality is that up until the referendum of whenever it was, 2016, June 2016, up until then, Britain had been in what we used to call the common market for 40 years. Up until 1973, though, Britain had been a fiercely independent trading nation. It got by pretty well without Europe. Why can it not be like that again?
It was known as the sick man of Europe until it joined the EU. You see, there's a lot of rewriting of history here. Britain's economy underperformed in the 50s and the 60s and got left behind by the Germans and the French. And successive British prime ministers, going back to Churchill, wanted Britain to be where the action was, this burgeoning market in Europe. And since Britain joined in 1973, the British economy has gained momentum, particularly since the creation of the single market, which, by the way, was masterminded by none other than Mrs. Thatcher, Mrs. Margaret Thatcher.
Yep.
So, in a sense, Mrs. May is turning her back on the legacy of a previous Tory Prime Minister.
So, where from here then? I mean, as we've said, this is the stalemate of all stalemates, so we're going to muck around and keep on having talks and gabfests until the 29th of March, and then we're going to have an extension.
I think February is going to be a decisive month, because I think Mrs. May's position is very precarious. And I think the other crucial potential game changer here, Peter, is that Mr. Corbyn can't be sitting on the fence forever. His MPs are becoming increasingly impatient. A very influential backbencher, David Lammy, said that if Mr. Corbyn can't show leadership in opposing Mrs. May's Brexit, then large numbers of Labour MPs will leave the party. This is not an idle threat. And so, there is momentum for a much more rigorous approach to opposing Brexit developing. At the moment, many people, the majority of people in Britain, have nowhere to go. It's a two-party system. It's not a proportional representation system like Britain, unlike New Zealand where we have MMP, the third party always has a huge disadvantage. At the moment, the two leaders in Britain, Jeremy Corbyn and Mrs May, the leaders of the two leading parties, both support Brexit. But I'm not sure that situation can endure once the looming disaster that is Brexit actually happens. So I think there will be a considerable concentration of minds. A number of British companies, over 170 British companies, large companies, have now demanded a second referendum. So,
Yep,
the
it does seem inevitable, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah,
Robert Patman, thank you so much again for your contribution this morning on this intrinsically difficult subject. I appreciate it, as always. Robert Patman from Otago University with his view on the stalemate of all stalemates, that is, a Brexit.